And that brings me to the rationale behind the First Amendment that I have introduced. Last week, President Obama admitted to the nation and to the world that he still does not, and I quote here, a complete strategy to deal with ISIS. A year ago this month, the terrorist organization, Islamic State, proclaimed itself as a worldwide caliphate, claiming to control territory in Syria and Iraq. ISIS quickly has become the largest, best organized, best financed, and most ambitious terrorist organization in history, not to mention the most brutal terrorist organization that we've ever seen. The previous Secretary of Defense and Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff described the threat arising from ISIS in apocalyptic terms. As well they should. The unspeakable depravities committed by ISIS are large enough and enough to evoke images of death's pale horse. ISIS has used sophisticated and successful internet and media outreach tools to attract tens of thousands of radical Islamists to join the fight in Syria, Iraq, and beyond. They have captured and controlled major population centers in Iraq, including Mosul, Fallujah, and Ramadi. They have secured their bases of operations in Syria and expanded the territory ISIS controls throughout Syria, threatening to dominate any successor state emerging from the Syrian civil war. In the meantime, ISIS has also expanded its influence and secured allegiance from cooperating terrorist organizations in Yemen, Liberia, Nigeria, Niger, Chad, and Cameroon. And early last year, the president compared ISIS to a junior varsity. Some junior varsity. Looks more like something that rises to the level of a major, major threat to the nations of the world, not just in the Middle East, but to the nations of the world. And to call it a junior varsity? Then, following the terrorist group dramatic expansion, later the president acknowledged the threat, but admitted, and I quote again, "We don't have a strategy yet," he said, to confront ISIS. Eventually, though, the president did come up with a plan that included two main elements: training moderate volunteers, non-American volunteers, but Iraqi volunteers, to fight ISIS in Syria, and training and equipping Iraqi defense forces to fight ISIS in Iraq. The first part of this plan has produced no fighters after a year of talk, and has just begun to train the first cohort of 400 volunteers, whose training is to be completed in another year or so, and even then they will be equipped to assume only defensive missions in Syria, according to the Pentagon. That's the U.S. portion. The Iraqi portion deals with training, which I'll be talking about here in just a moment. How could this severely limited strategy be even remotely responsive to the ISIS, to the means that the ISIS and the threat ISIS poses? How is it that ISIS manages to recruit, transport, train, deploy, and effectively fight tens of thousands of radical men and women, while we're spending 2 years finding and training just 400 in our program in Syria? In Iraq, 10 years and billions of dollars spent creating defense forces has produced nothing capable of standing up to the ISIS fanatics. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff said earlier this month that Iraqi forces, and I quote again, did not have the will to fight when confronted a vastly inferior Islamic State force at this particular battle. They just melted away in Mosul and Ramadi, said the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Those that we had spent months, if not years, and spent very significant amounts of money in training, just simply melted away because they did not have the will to fight. The president's intention to train and equip Iraqi forces to confront the Islamic State has failed to produce an effective fighting force that is adequately led and sufficiently equipped. That is the only conclusion that we can come to after months and years and extraordinary expenditures of dollars to try to deal with the ISIS threat. The other major component of the President's strategy is airstrikes. Air power, when used as part of an integrated grand strategy, can play an essential role. In this case, there is no integrated larger strategy, and therefore air power is limited in terms of what it can do. The administration's airstrikes have been much less effective in dealing with the ISIS threat than anticipated. They have not halted ISIS advances in the region. In the words of retired Air Force General David DePula, a key architect of the air campaign in Operation Desert Storm, I quote, "Air power has to be applied like a thunderstorm, not a drizzle. In the campaign against the Islamic State, we are averaging 12 strike sorties per day. During Operation Desert Storm in Iraq and Kuwait, the average was 1,241. Air power, when properly utilized in concert with troops that support the effort, can bring battlefield success. However, the Obama administration has failed to provide the proper number of well-trained American spotters on the ground in Iraq designating targets. If you do not have forces in positions to target the exact target, air power becomes random and not nearly as effective as it should be. And that has not been authorized by the President as a means of dealing with this issue. And so therefore, the limits that have been placed on the use of air power have left us in a situation where they are much less effective than they could be. So it's now been over a year since ISIS was widely acknowledged as a major threat to our national security. And when asked just last week what is and is not working in the fight against ISIS, the President stated once again that we still do not have a complete strategy to confront ISIS. Instead, he blamed the Pentagon and the Iraqis for not finalizing a plan. And yet the President says that we still do not have a complete strategy to address this threat. How is that possible? As the Wall Street Journal put it in its June 11th editorial, and I quote again, "The fundamental problem with Mr. Obama's strategy is that he is so determined to show that the U.S. isn't returning to war in Iraq that he isn't doing enough to win the war we're fighting." And in the meantime, the White House announced that we would be sending another 450 troops to Iraq to train Sunni tribal fighters. I understand that this really means a little more than 50 actual trainers, the rest of this small cohort, to provide security for themselves. So we're down to about 50 trainers, and that's the next step in dealing with a threat that far expands the need to do much, much more. We must insist that President Obama immediately produce a complete, detailed, and realistic plan to confront, degrade, and defeat the Islamic State. This plan must include realistic, self-substantiated estimates of timeframes, resources required, expected allies, and anticipated obstacles, and also must include clear definitions of milestones and metrics of success. And most importantly, the plan must include clear accountability. So I have introduced an amendment to the Defense Authorization Bill that would require just that: a serious, credible, complete strategy for addressing the threat posed by ISIS. President Obama has shown a tendency to blame others, the Pentagon or allies or Sunnis or the Iraqi government or Congress, for his own failures of leadership in this effort. And therefore, we must demand a coherent, realistic plan so that the American people can properly apportion the credit for success or the blame for failure where it belongs.